Especially appreciative tonight because our guest, Lamia, has been in here, I think, for pretty much 5 out of the last 6 days, working hard on this installation. And again, today when I came in here and I saw that wall, really, tears come to my eyes. I mean, if you haven't been to the back room, you always need to go into the back room, but especially tonight. It just feels like such a huge gift to do this, and I'm just thrilled. So I appreciate everybody coming out tonight. So I just have Nick's bio here that I'll read to you. Nick Lamia is an award-winning artist whose work includes drawing, painting, printmaking, installation, and sculpture. Despite its non-objective appearance, this is your statement. I meant to, oh well.
No, I think
Is this your bio?
I think that's right.
Okay. Despite its non-objective appearance, all of his artwork is based on real lived experience, often involving outdoor adventures in mountains and on the ocean. His artworks are metaphoric representations of the overlap of the natural world with the constructed world of man. He is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship as well as residencies at Wave Hill, the McDowell Colony, the Robert Blackburn Print Workshop, and the Triangle Artists Association. 500 of his small-scale drawings were included in the inaugural Bronx Museum Biennial in 2011. Recent solo exhibitions include Cloud Architecture at Plant House Gallery in New York and the Tailwaters Project at the, is that AVA? Is that how you say it? AVA Gallery in New Hampshire, where proceeds went to supporting the Greater Upper Valley chapter of Trout Unlimited and their ongoing effort to protect and restore cold water fisheries and watersheds. So, I've been a real fan of your work for many years, and if you spent any time on my website, you've seen how influenced that my work used to be by your work. But one of the things that I think is so interesting about your work is your background, and I think it would be really interesting for the students to hear a little bit about your background, how you came to be a painter, how you came from this environmental science background, and just all the adventures, as you said, that you've had outdoors and how that's influenced your work.
Thank you all for being here tonight. It means a lot for me that almost every chair is full. I didn't know what to expect, and I'm very pleased about the number of people that are in the room. So if you'd like to speak about my background, we may need to reserve a few more hours. But I won't. I did a talk a couple weeks ago in which I did spend over an hour talking about my background and sort of trying to shed some light on the question that Suzanne just asked. So that was good practice, and I'll try to create a synopsis. This conversation has not been rehearsed, so I'm just going to do the best I can to give you some information that I hope will be of interest. So, as Suzanne mentioned, I come at this from probably a slightly different trajectory than you might expect, and than I think many visual artists do. I have always loved drawing. That's kind of where I started, and that's sort of what I feel like is the foundation for everything that I do. In fact, just to go on a little bit of an aside, I kind of think about everything in this room as drawing. So if you're looking to put a name on, I use other names because they're sort of more standard practice for the visual arts industry to call something like what you see on the floor here an installation artwork, and what you see on the canvases on the wall, paintings. But for me, and I do call them paintings and I think of them as paintings, but ultimately everything goes back to drawing. For me, drawing is a practice of making marks and choosing the place where they're going to go and choosing the character that they have. But I think that could be said for the blocks of wood that are on the ground. I'm choosing where they go, and I'm choosing a particular block that has a particular character to go in a particular location. So in that sense, all of it is related to drawing. But my background is not in visual arts, at least not during my education. I loved science. I studied biology in college, and I majored in environmental science with a biological emphasis, which meant that I spent a lot of time, not a lot of time in college for school doing outdoor things, but my thesis in college was this sounds so boring, but I loved it. It was a study of the biodiversity of a salt marsh in the Bay Area. And so basically what I did was I went around in a salt marsh that was in a pretty urban situation, but it was sort of a reserved piece of land. So here in New Jersey, you have a lot of salt marsh, and you probably don't ever want to go tromping around in those salt marshes that you see as you drive into Manhattan, for example. But I was tromping around out in a place like that. It was in a place called the Richmond Field Station, and I was setting traps and catching mice. That's pretty much what I was doing. And I won't go into any more detail about that. The point is that I started off in science, and one of the things that happened during my studies was that I kept lab notebooks. We were all required to keep notebooks about what we were looking at, what we were noticing, what we were seeing. And like I said, I'd always loved drawing, and so I spent a lot of time drawing in my lab notebooks. And it dawned on me at one point that it was the visual representation of the information that was equally interesting to me as the information itself. So it was really, I always loved to draw, and I had drawings from being a kid all through my life, but it was really only in college that I really began to think, this thing that has been a passion of mine forever, but which has never been part of my academic life, might be actually the thing that I want to put all my energy into. But even after that, it took a little while. I think that expectations from my family, expectations from my friends, and expectations even from myself were sort of pushing me in a different direction. Not to say that my family hasn't been supportive. Like, my parents were always supportive of what I was doing, but I think my dad particularly was kind of like, I don't know, I'm not sure this is going to be like the thing for you. And he wasn't trying to steer me away, but he was cautioning me, which was a good idea, because I caution anybody who wants to make a living going into this field, because it's extremely challenging and very hard to predict as far as the income goes. That's a whole other story. I've been very fortunate in that respect, and it's not to say that I make a ton of money, but I have been able to piece together things along the way that have allowed me to continue. And I have watched many friends peel away because it's so difficult and so challenging. So I'm very happy and grateful to be able to be here, and I don't take it for granted. It's an ongoing kind of battle that I don't think probably ever ends for most people. But at a certain time, I did realize, this was a couple years after I graduated from college, I went and I lived in Yosemite National Park for a couple of years. I had a job on a sailboat. My first job out of college was on a sailboat, and it was just me and one other person who was the boat owner. And I spent not a ton of time on that boat, but we sailed from Virginia to Bermuda to St. Thomas, and then around the Caribbean for a little while, and I was supposed to help him do that. And he had more experience living on the boat. I had more sailing experience. But I had never really done any sailing quite like that. So it surprises me even now that my parents allowed, I was 21, 22. A little bit surprising that my parents just let me go, because nobody knew who this guy was. I was getting on the boat just with him, and who knows what was gonna happen. And that was 1994. 1994, we were sailing in the fall. We left in like mid-October probably. Hurricane Florence happened in October of 1994, and we got caught in Hurricane Florence. Not in the center of the storm, but in one of the peripheral arms. The boat that we were on was 32 feet long, which is shorter than this room, about the length of this room. I think this room is 30 feet. I measured it at one point. So
better than anybody.
In any case, the boat was relatively small. It looks big while we're sitting in here, but when you get on a boat that's that size and you're in the ocean, it's quite small. And so a hurricane in a 32-foot boat is not a place that you really want to be. And we were there because Gary, who is the boat owner, had decided that he really wanted to get to St. Thomas from Bermuda, and we needed to outrun the storm, which we were advised urgently against by many of the guys that were sitting around the harbor. But Gary decided we'd leave anyway. So we did. We left on a Friday, which is bad luck. If any of you all are sailors, then you maybe know that leaving port on a Friday is not advised. Superstitious, yes, but in our case, it turned out to be true. We probably shouldn't have left. In any case, we made it to St. Thomas, and although we suffered some things along the way, it was kind of a scary trip, but we did make it. But once we got there and we spent a little time down there, I got to do some scuba diving, which was also at that time in my life a big thing for me. But I decided I can't stick around on this boat. There's a line that exists somewhere between sort of bravery and adventure, and there's a division between that and foolhardiness and just taking chances that are not worth it. And Gary had a different idea about where that line was, and I just decided it wasn't going to be for me. So I flew back to the U.S., and it was literally within days that I got 2 job offers, and they were very different offers. One was a job offer to join a law firm as a paralegal. That was with my environmental science background. I was thinking about environmental law, and so I wanted to see what it might be like to be in that profession. So I decided I'd try to be a paralegal for a little while to help me to make that decision. But on the same day, I got an offer from this organization called the Yosemite Institute, which is a school in Yosemite National Park. It's an unconventional place where I was able to teach geology and other sciences, meteorology, kind of in situ, in the park, using the park as a classroom. There was no classroom that we had that was part of a building. Our classroom was the outdoors. So I chose to take that route. And again, my dad, who was a lawyer, was like, oh, all right, I'll support you. What is he doing? So fortunately for me, the law firm, which was the firm that I really wanted to be a part of, told me that they would hold a spot for me for 6 months, which is very generous. That's, I think, not something that happens much. And so I was like, great, I can go, I can do this, I can get it out of my system. And then, well, it was 2 years later that I decided to move to New York, because I had made that unusual decision to move to Yosemite, and it was amazing to live there. I had been to Yosemite many times in college, and I have cherished memories of that place from before I ever worked there. But once I did, that decision really kind of changed the whole trajectory, I think, of my life. Because it was making that unusual decision and having it work out in such a great way, where I felt like I really grew as a person. I had experiences that I never would have had even an opportunity to have if I hadn't done that. That all kind of coalesced in my mind and gave me the courage to really decide, you know what? It's visual art that I really want to focus on and put all my energy into. So I knew just a single person who was in the art world. His name is John Walker. He's a British painter. He's lived in the US for a long time though. And I didn't really know him very well, but he had told me at one point, if you really want to do this, if you want to get into visual arts, then keep in touch with me. And if you make the decision to do that, I'll try to kind of point you in the right direction. He told me, you cannot do this from the backcountry of the Sierra Nevada. You have to go to a city. And he said, I think you should go to New York City, and you should begin the pursuit of this dream there. So that's what I did. I came to New York in 1996 and started going to school for art, and spent 2 years doing that, and then applied for a master's degree. I went to Boston University for my master's degree, where that guy, John Walker, was the head of the graduate painting department. So I was able to study with him, which is what I really had ultimately wanted to do. And I finished in 2000, and then I came away from BU with a master's degree in painting, And that's how the whole that's where I started. That was the beginning for me. And I moved back to New York and had a whole bunch of terrible jobs while I tried to keep all of this going. And now I have a better job now. And I do love it. I teach. Right now I'm teaching at the Fashion Institute of Technology, FIT, which frankly I didn't even know they had an art department before I was asked to teach a class there. And at that time I was teaching in a bunch of different places, but I eventually kind of consolidated everything down to FIT, which is the only place that I'm teaching at the moment. And I love it, and I especially love it for the students. So I'm really glad to see a bunch of people who I think are students here. Because I think ultimately, for professors, at least for me, the real payoff is being able to have conversations with other people who are at the earlier stages of their kind of creative pursuits and who are wondering about a lot of the same things that I wondered about when I was there, and many of which I still wonder about, but some of the practical things I can probably help you out with. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from, and as I've mentioned and as Suzanne mentioned, the background in environmental science, I think still, at least in my mind, plays a major role in all of what I'm doing, and the experiences that I had outdoors are sort of foremost in my mind while I'm working and putting together imagery. And so what I will say, which you may doubt, is that everything in here in some way connects back to real experience of mine, most of which is, almost all of it, is outdoor experiences. And these images relate to landscape in some way. So I get it. If you're hearing my words and you're looking at the pictures and you're like, those two things don't go together. That's true, because the images are not easily recognizable as landscape. And I don't have any visual aids. But when I gave this talk a couple weeks ago, I showed some photographs, which I don't always do. I showed photographs of particular locations, and then I compared them to the paintings that you can see. And when you see the photographs next to the paintings, then connections sort of fall into place and become clear. I'm completely talking more than I should, so you stop me if you want to, or if you have another question. I'm happy to answer it, but I'll just say one other, maybe like 10 more things. That is that there are always these direct connections, but that's kind of more important for me as building material, ingredients for the pictures that I make. And also, I like the idea that for you all, you just have the knowledge that there is something concrete that's there. But I want people to experience the paintings kind of in painting terms. I want people to have a visual experience rather than me try to illustrate the experience that I had somewhere else at some other time. Those experiences are fundamental to these images and to my making them, but they are not, those experiences specifically are not fundamental to your ability to look at the paintings. And I hope that you will that they are sort of interesting enough for you to look at, that you can have your own experience, your own kind of visual adventure, and know in the back of your mind that, like, indeed there is some specific thing that he did, that he experienced, that resulted in this picture, but I don't have to know what that is exactly to, I hope, kind of get interested enough to look for a little while. That's ultimately the goal, is to kind of grab people's attention and give them an experience that they might not have had otherwise, and to just really ultimately kind of enjoy looking at this thing for a little while. And hopefully looking at it and looking at its relationship with the other things that are part of this exhibition, and making your own connections, noticing your own, the things that stand out to you. I hope I've put enough here to give everybody some kind of an experience that they will find interesting enough to kind of pause for a little bit and not just walk right by. I'll stop there.
There are so many things I want to saying, you know, in response to so many things that you talked about, but where you just landed reminded me of something. And as I said before, I was watching maybe like the second half of your talk at the New York Studio School today, and you said this thing about the idea of just like, as the artist, just saying, I don't have any intention in terms of what people get out of this. Whatever people get out of it is what they get out of it. I want it to be completely subjective, and you were saying that you think that that's a cop-out. Remember that?
Yeah.
So we had this, we kind of had a conversation around this topic last week, and I brought that up because I hear students say this a lot. I don't know if you hear this in classes that you teach, like, I just want to leave it open to the viewer. I don't want to, you know, and I don't know where exactly it comes from, but this, like, I don't want to put too much of my own intention into it somehow, and maybe we have a very big art therapy program here, so it may at least partly come from art therapy and the idea that making art is totally process oriented, and it's very experiential and personal. Can you articulate why you think that's a cop-out?
Sure. So yes, I did say that, and I do believe it, but there's sort of a little bit more background information that might be necessary to not make it sound like something that I'm saying in a mean-spirited way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what I said was something along the lines of, I think it's a cop-out when artists think something like, I want the viewer to interpret the picture like however they want. It can be about anything that you want it to be about. That to me is kind of like, in some ways, like shirking the responsibilities of the person who's made this thing. On the other hand, I don't want to dictate what people's experience is. So in a way, I guess there's probably a gray area between those two things that's difficult to define. But I do think, what I often find myself sort of trying to express to students and other people is that, let me see if I can avoid losing my train of thought here. Let's see, hold on, just bear with me for a moment. I want to orchestrate myself. I think that it is important to operate from a position of knowledge as opposed to from a position of ignorance. And when somebody, myself included, particularly a little while ago, doesn't have really clear ideas about what they're trying to do, or doesn't have the technical facility to do what it is that they're hoping to be able to do, it's very easy to just kind of like, and forgive me, this is sort of a crass way to put it, but like, it's very easy to sort of splash some paint around and then tell people that you can just see what you want. Because that really doesn't require any effort, and it's not taking responsibility for what you're doing. So that would be sort of, I would classify that as operating from a position of ignorance, just kind of allowing things to happen, and I don't really care where the paint goes or what it's doing. It's gonna look interesting enough because it's just gonna be kind of splashed around. And plenty of people have made what we call art by splashing paint around, so it's in some ways kind of accepted, right? But that's what I think is a cop-out, is, you know, operating from this position of ignorance or inability, and then just like saying that it can be whatever people want it to be because I can't really do anything else, right? That's the cop-out. What I'm trying to do is allow people to interpret the pictures and have some kind of a range of open possibilities for interpretation, but to make the images from a position of knowledge, in a way that's specific, right? So I am trying to have specificity in the paintings, even though this is where it gets a little bit weird. I hope that there's specificity there, but specificity that allows a viewer to have their own interpretations. Another way to think about it would be, I kind of feel like the very best storytellers are people who give enough information for their audience's imaginations to go to work on whatever it was that the storyteller expressed, but not so much information that the entire story has just been spoon-fed to the audience. Because if the entire story has been spoon-fed to you, your brain has nothing to work on. There's nothing to chew there, right? Whereas if you've been given enough information to give your brain, your mind, something to think about, an opportunity to fill in some blanks for yourself, then number one, the story will relate more to you because your mind is filling in some gaps, using your own life experience to do so. And also because that experience becomes a participatory experience where you're not just sitting back and allowing the story or the painting to just wash over you passively. You're actively engaged because your brain has to work on whatever information it is that you've been given to do that, to fill in those blanks and to have that experience. So now I have lost my train of thought, but I think I've expressed what I hoped to express. Yeah, so position of knowledge versus position of ignorance, and oh, I know where I was. Not giving the audience like so much information that it's just a passive experience. So I kind of think about the images as, even though I'm thinking about a specific event or a specific location when I'm working on them, I also like the idea that ultimately, like I said before, I'm not illustrating those things. Like I'm not, this painting's called couloir. You wouldn't look at it and think, oh, that looks like a couloir. A couloir is like a steep-sided valley on a mountainside. But this painting is the result of an experience that I had where a couloir was involved. And to me, I'm able to put enough sort of specificity into the image that what I hope will happen is that people will look at it, their mind will latch onto it, and they will think, there's something there. There's something there that I want to recognize, but I can't quite get there. I can't quite wrap my head around it, but I'm interested enough, or my brain is interested enough in trying to decipher that image that I'm gonna spend some time with it. And I'm gonna look, and I'm gonna start comparing angles, and I'm gonna look at the way that these shapes relate to one another, and the way that these colors maybe interact. And I've said this already, so but I'll say it again because I think it's kind of a good image. I like it when the paintings they remind me of like ultraviolet light, that we all know ultraviolet light exists, but it's outside of our range of perception, so we don't see ultraviolet light, right? But we know it's there. Or another way of thinking about it would be like, in a dream state, you're lucid, everything makes sense, you totally get it, and then you wake up and you try to explain your dream to somebody, and that dream logic falls apart in our waking logic. They're different. Well, in visual arts, the logic of a picture, for me, particularly abstract pictures, is kind of like dream logic. It makes total sense while you're in that moment, but then when I come here and I try to explain it to you that this is about a couloir, that logic doesn't really make sense in our waking life, right? But it does for me in the moment when I'm making it, and I hope that I'm able to sort of pull enough specificity from that dream logic or painting logic world, put it there in front of you, that you'll be able to latch onto it and know that there is some kind of ultraviolet light going on there, that I know this thing exists, I can feel that there's something real there. I just can't name it. I can't tell you that it's about a grasshopper or whatever else it might be about. But there is a grasshopper back there somewhere for me while I'm painting it, so there's that little nugget of truth that exists in the foundation for all of these images.
So when you were, one thing, when you were at Berkeley, did you take any art classes?
Barely. I think I took one painting class where the instructor, who has actually gotten a lot of attention over the last couple of years, and I've tried to reconnect with her, but I haven't been successful in that. In any case, she showed up on the first day of the semester. And she introduced herself, and she introduced us to her teaching assistant, and then I never saw her again for like the whole semester. Maybe like in passing in the hallway. And the teaching assistant was basically the same. It was like, do whatever you want. But I took the class, I loved it, and I don't think I really learned a lot, but I got to splash some paint around. I can remember painting a really nasty, evil, scary-looking picture that was sort of based on an Iron Maiden album cover in my room, and listening to Nirvana, learning about Nirvana for the first time. But that was kind of my experience painting in college. I also took another painting class that I dropped.
So the reason that there's a few reasons that I asked, but one thing is, I could come at this from so many different places. I used to teach, I used to be an adjunct and teach in many different places, and I taught adults out of my home. And I had this one student who he had been a physicist, he was a physics professor, and he was just so dedicated and really into making art. And he was in his 60s, and he eventually took some undergraduate classes and ended up getting his master's degree. Actually, he passed away of COVID before he could get his master's degree, but he was working towards his master's degree in his 60s. And I learned that, because I was like, why is Mark so, just so into this? And I learned that it was from the drawings that he did as a physicist.
Wow.
And he showed me some of the drawings, and I was like, wow, he drew better than I did when I was an art student, when he was young as a physicist, and I'm sure that he drew all the time. So I'm just gonna put that to the side for a moment. Were you aware of Diebenkorn and the Bay Area figurative painters when you were living in the Bay Area? Were they at all an influence on you? I'm trying to kind of get at how you ended up making the decision to go into art. What was in your environment that was influencing even what you were making at the time? Like, were you drawing in sketchbooks? What were you drawing?
Diebenkorn? Who's that?
You may have to.
That's my canned response. That's my new. I haven't had an opportunity to. I thought. Okay, so.
Have you gotten that a lot?
Oh, almost always somebody asks me about Diebenkorn, which is a logical question.
But it's not something that I thought about for a long time. Like, I think it just occurred to me last week, even though now that I think of it, it seems obvious, but
yeah.
Anyway.
Well, I get the question less now than I once did, because I think I have kind of strayed a little bit in a different direction from the one that I love Diebenkorn, first of all. But my response, which only now have I had an opportunity to kind of use for the Diebenkorn question, is, who's Diebenkorn? I had anticipated getting a question about Diebenkorn at the studio school a couple weeks ago, and I had realized, oh, I can respond, but as if I don't even know who he was. But nobody asked, so I didn't get to use it. Now I did. Thank you for that. But yeah, I love Diebenkorn. I was aware of him when I was in college, particularly because he did spend some significant years in that part of the country. And because I saw some of his paintings at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And also, that same class that I had where the instructor never showed up, did we talk about this? No. One day, we're all in there, we're doing our thing, and the teacher's not there, of course. And so we're in the class, and I'm sure, like, looking back on it now, we're probably like 5 of us in there. Because if I know anything now about teaching, if the teacher's not there, the students aren't going to show up. But a couple of us were there, and we're in there drawing, and this old guy comes in. He's like walking around, and he doesn't introduce himself. And he starts talking about, what are those Greek, God, Jeff, you might know, like, it's like, sort of like fertility and destruction, these two Greek, I guess, gods. I can't remember, Thanatos maybe, something like that? I don't know.
That's that, yeah. Keep going, you're better than me.
Anyway, he started talking about these sort of like oppositional forces. And he was using these two Greek gods to illustrate his point, and talking about, I don't remember what, some story about these oppositional forces becoming, it's like, I think it's Hegel who has this idea about sort of like thesis and antithesis coming together to create synthesis. It's a similar idea to that. And I love that idea. I love the idea of oppositional forces. I think about it a lot while I'm working. But the guy who's talking about all this stuff starts talking also about this image that's of like a military kind of coat that's on a hanger that's hanging on a door. It's a print, I think. It might have been a drawing. And he was showing us this picture about this coat and this hanger. And it was very kind of geometricized. And I thought it was cool. And I was making paintings and drawings of ladders. So it has an idea of like transporting from one place to another. And so I loved the geometry of the ladders, and I liked the geometry of this shirt. And then later, I saw that picture in a book, and it was a book about Diebenkorn, and the picture that he was showing us was this Diebenkorn image. And then I saw a picture of Diebenkorn himself in that same book, and I realized that guy that came into our class was Richard Diebenkorn.
Wow.
And he had taught at the school where I was, which was UC Berkeley, but he wasn't teaching there at the time that I was there. I think he might have been like a professor emeritus or something. And so I don't know like for a fact that it was him, but I'm pretty sure that that was Richard Diebenkorn. So I hope it was, because then I can say that I met Richard Diebenkorn, even though, you know, it wasn't a real meeting. It was just a random thing where he happened to show up in our classroom one day and start talking about Greek gods. You know, but he lived in the area, so it's not outside of the realm of possibilities that it was him. And I even now I look back at the pictures of him in the books, and I'm thinking like, that was the guy. That was the guy that was in there. I would love to have, like, especially now, I would love to talk to him. But I would love to have like really known who it was when he was in the room.
Yeah.
But yes, Diebenkorn has certainly been someone who I have looked up to. And there's a lineage that I see, at least, and I think other people do too, that Diebenkorn leads back to Matisse. And there's a particular painting that's by Matisse that's he painted several times a view of Notre Dame, and there's one in particular that's almost entirely blue, with a couple of sort of structural lines and a little patch of green where I presume there was a bush or something. But that painting was very influential on me.
Mm-hmm.
Just the idea that you could take a real scene and you could sort of take a lot of liberty with it. He maintained I think a closer, he kept himself on a little bit of a shorter leash than I do maybe, as far as like maintaining faithfulness to the original image. So you can still see like the kind of silhouette of Notre Dame in that picture. And so there's a little bit of a clearer link to a reality that you could name in that painting, but it's that idea of taking a real life thing and then kind of using that as a jumping off point for a picture that becomes something else, something that's beyond just a view, just an illustration, right? Which is not to say that all representational painting is illustration, because I don't think that. It's just that I am at the moment, I mean, I love drawing from life as well. It just happens that the things that you see here are all based on life, but not representing what we would recognize as life as we normally see it.
And maybe before we open up for questions, you could talk a little bit about process, because for one thing, I think it's really important for students to hear about, you know, an artist's process. One thing that I love about the show is we get to see so many different aspects of your process. But I think that as somebody who also has kind of I go back and forth between representation and abstraction. But actually thinking back to my own days in graduate school at the San Francisco Art Institute, studying with one of Diebenkorn's students, Bruce McGaugh. When I got to graduate school, I was painting still lifes, and I really wanted to make abstract paintings, and I had no idea how to start an abstract painting. It just seemed like, to me, it seemed so difficult and just so opaque. And I ended up spending a semester basically making my own version of Willem de Kooning's. I just like made all these black and white enamel paintings, and read about his process, and eventually kind of, you know, figured out how to, you know, I just did something, you know, and it's just a matter of doing something. But I think a lot of people, and including students, don't understand when they look at an abstract painting how it was made, and I get the feeling that a lot of people think that it's all kind of planned out beforehand and don't understand the idea of kind of not knowing where you're going and it all just kind of unfolding as you're painting. And I guess I just would like you to talk a little bit about how you do that. I know you mentioned in your talk at the studio school about not really working from photographs. I know you're working more from using photographs as references now, but just that, yeah, not planning out beforehand and why that's important to you.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. One of the frustrating things for me, despite the fact that you kind of, you see that there's, like if you saw this show, you saw all these paintings, and then you went somewhere else and you saw another one of my paintings that is kind of in this vein, you'd probably be able to immediately make the connection, oh, that's the same person made that, which might lead you to believe that they are planned out in some way. But in fact, one of the frustrating things about painting for me is that every time I get in front of the new canvas, it's kind of like starting from scratch again. There is no plan. I never have a plan for the drawings, for the paintings, nor for these other arrangements of objects. Everything that you see in the room was improvised in some way. So the paintings and the drawings were improvised in the studio, where I don't have a plan for how they're going to be made. I have the only plan really that exists is like what materials I'm going to use to make it. And so then the question becomes, well, if there's never a plan, why do the paintings all like have a certain resemblance to one another? I don't know that I have a good answer for that, other than the sort of like squishy answer of, well, that's kind of the way that I'm feeling right now. But that is a truthful answer in the sense that, yes, they're made through improvisation and they're made through kind of instinct and trusting instinct. And if you look carefully at the paintings, for the most part, you'll also see that there are lots and lots of decisions that have been made. In other words, I change my mind a lot, right? Like this line needs to move somewhere else, or this thing that I made here, I don't really like it anymore, so I'm gonna cover it up or I'm gonna scrape it away. So there's a lot of physical activity that happens as part of the process, and all of that physical activity is an adventure in a way. It is the adventure of kind of trusting yourself enough to execute whatever idea it was that just popped into mind, and then to kind of look at it with an analytical eye and decide whether that decision was something that should remain a part of the painting for now, or whether it should be removed at this point, and then a new idea gets tried. So it's a long process of basically trial and error. Even in the pictures, the more recent pictures where I am using photographs as a sort of stronger source material. And that's something I don't think I really touched on before, which is that for a long time the paintings, though based on particular experiences, were not coming from a specific image. I would follow instinct, and eventually during the process of painting them, they would sort of spark a memory for me. And then I would sort of think, oh, this image has now begun to remind me of this particular bicycle ride that I took. I used to ride my bike at night under the full moon through roads that were closed in the Sierra. That's a whole other thing, and it's amazing, but it's also kind of a weird thing to do. But so maybe a painting begins to resemble something that I recognize from one of those experiences. Well, at that point, then I can begin to kind of like fine-tune the painting to get it closer to that memory, not illustrating that memory necessarily, but maybe thinking about, oh, the way that the moonlight shined or reflected off of the snowbanks that were along the side of the road, and how those snowbanks weren't white. You know, you think snow, you think white, but like, it's not really white. You have to look at it a little bit more carefully to determine what color it really is, particularly at night. In any case, the paintings started out very, very sort of free form and eventually coalesced around an idea. as opposed to the ones that are more recent. They look similar, but the more recent paintings are often made from a specific photograph or a specific situation, and then I'm still following instinct and still improvising, but I have to kind of find a way to stay tethered to the original photograph in some way. So they're, despite the fact that the paintings resemble one another, they are made in different ways. The more recent ones just mostly from photographs. As far as starting, if I had a formula for making paintings, they would look even more close to one another, I think, as far as the images go. I start by making marks and trust, and then making more marks and finding relationships among those marks, and either discarding that relationship or trying to build upon it. I don't know if I can explain it any more than that. It is difficult. There is no, like, if you show me 10 abstract painters and I'll show you 10 different ways of starting an abstract painting. So I don't know that there's like one thing that a person could say to students or anybody else as far as like, this is how you do it, because there isn't really a clear answer to that question, I don't think. If there is, I don't know what it is.
Yeah, and I think that that's one thing that I find very difficult about teaching is you can't explain this stuff, and I think the way that I learned was being around other artists and watching other artists make art.
Yeah.
And having to figure it out, just being kind of in a studio and knowing that I had a critique and having to come up with something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there are, like, let's do a mental exercise for a moment. Let's say you have, a big piece of black paper, and you have like a white paper circle and a white paper triangle. You've got a circle and a triangle to work with, and you've got a black background. And so you put those things down. Well, you could put the black paper on the floor and just drop the white shapes onto it, and they would land in some way. And that way might be interesting to you for whatever reason, or it might not. That would be starting a painting randomly. Or you could take that black surface and you could put a white circle and a white triangle on it with intention. And you don't know what's going to happen yet, but you make a decision about where that circle is going to go and where that triangle is going to go. And you look at it and you think, okay, that's kind of interesting, but it might be more interesting if I do this, and you change it a little bit. That's starting an abstract painting. Recognizing a relationship among ingredients and trying to find a way to make that relationship more and more and more interesting by altering it and allowing it to evolve. And then maybe you introduce a square or a line or another circle. Who knows? The possibilities are really endless, but it's a matter of looking with an open mind and allowing your analytical self to kind of go to work on it and making a decision. Do I think that this relationship that I'm observing is something that's worth exploring a little bit further, or does it need to be changed in some way? And then trusting yourself to make a decision and just executing. It's not that like you can make any old decision, but any old decision will do as far as doing something that allows you to further analyze. If that makes some sense.
I could talk to you for another 5 hours about this stuff, but I'm aware of the fact that we should probably open it up to questions. Bayan and then Christos.
Hi, my name is Bayan.
Hi, Bayan.
I was a student under Professor Suzanne and Professor Larry. Forgive me for going a little slower while I collect my thoughts. I'm a little sleep deprived. I'm looking at your exhibition, and I'm looking at your organic material and connecting it to more contemporary paintings, more abstract paintings, and I like the connection there because on the personal level, I really like this part because as I was traveling across the US, I was collecting some rocks from different national parks, different areas and hikes, and they all look different. All of them look different, right? And sadly, I couldn't take them back with me because it got too heavy, and rocks are pretty heavy. But I'm looking at it, and I'm looking at your paintings over here, and those remind me of the outdoors because from different angles while I was taking photography of scenery, it looks like lines, you know, there's a tree, and this part of the tree is all green, then you see a line of the horizon, and there's the sun, the sky, this color is just flat blue, or one color, you know, and the bottom is, what's it called, brown. So it's like, you can see abstract parts of nature from a different angle. So that's what I'm seeing in those paintings, which I really like, and personally, I don't know the intention. That painting reminds me of Glacier National Park, which it's beautiful. I mean, the colors itself, it reminds me of mountains. And
Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, go.
I was just gonna say that's I love to hear that, because the title, you're talking about the one with the kind of like grayish purple top.
Yes.
Yeah, that is called Lyle Approach, and it's based on an experience that I had climbing a mountain called Mount Lyle, which is the tallest mountain in Yosemite, and it has a glacier on it. So your comment about Glacier National Park is appropriate, and we climbed on that glacier to get to the summit that day, and it was one of my favorite experiences from
Yosemite is
having lived
beautiful.
there.
Yeah.
But I want to back up for a second to the rocks that you talked about. Didn't it feel like, did you find that you made a connection to those rocks that you
I
collected?
did, because they're all, like, a lot of them are different colors, and you don't see that often when you're in the city, like around here. And I traveled through train and, you know, a car,
Mhm.
but mostly by train. And what the train goes through is what cars can't reach, right? And it was the first time I've seen a wide range of colors in rocks. I saw
Mhm.
blue, orange, red, bright red, which was really nice, but purples and all of those colors, which I really didn't see around me, like
Yeah.
this area. And so when I'm looking at that, it hits home, because I really like that trip, that really long trip. And I like the connection you're making with the lines that connects both of them together. My question was, because this reminds me of a timeline, right? All these lines connecting it. I'm looking at them and they look technical. Like when you open a laptop and you see all these mechanics inside it. That's what it reminds me of. And I'm just wondering about your intention, because those are more, you have more organic manner over here, and you have abstract, but then I'm looking at the lines and they remind me of something more technical.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering about that.
Okay, that's a good question, and a perceptive one. So I mentioned my sort of interest in environmental science, and one of the results of that interest has been that I am a believer in the idea that we must find a way for society, us, and the rest of the natural world to coexist in a better way. And so early on, I began thinking about that idea, and although other people have done it, other people have been able to communicate political ideas and maybe even to make political change through visual arts. That is something that I haven't really done. Not because I'm not interested, but just because I can't figure out a way to do it. How do you change people's minds through making a painting, right? That's a challenging thing. So what I did want to do was to try to address the issue of, in my mind, the importance of bringing society and nature together in a more symbiotic kind of a way by making pictures that included both organic elements and more geometric elements. So geometry to kind of symbolize humanity and society, and because we're manipulating things and creating structures like the circuit boards that you're talking about, and the rest of the natural world, which includes geometry, but I think most people would probably say is, at least in their minds, is more made up of things that are organically shaped, more irregularly shaped. So it's this combination of organic and geometric being brought together that, to me, sort of metaphorically, I hope, conveys an idea of society and nature coming together. So that's the underlying reason for the combination that you're talking about. I'm glad that you see it, because that means that I've done enough to make it clear that it's there. And some of the artworks sort of veer more in one direction or the other. And if I had pictures of paintings that I could show you that I painted over the last 25 years or so, I could show you images where they're very organic and like swirling and they look like something that you might see if you look through a microscope, you know. But now, at this point, for reasons that I can't explain, I am more, my instinct that I continue to trust takes me in a slightly more geometric direction. That could change again. They could end up becoming much more organic than they are at this point. But for the moment, they're sort of more structurally. They look more structural.
Right.
Yeah.
They're beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, would you call yourself a mixed media artist? Because it looks to me like you're using a lot of different materials, and that's what I really like about it.
Thank you very much. I'm just a drawer. Yeah, that would be. I think that would be accurate. Mixed
Okay.
media. I don't. Honestly, I sort of define myself as a painter. I feel like that's a straightforward word that is clear to people, and that gives people an idea about what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. Because on a day-to-day basis, I am not in my studio moving rocks around or sticks or anything like that. I don't use an easel, but I'm at the wall where I have canvases and I'm painting, or I'm at my drawing table and I'm drawing. So I do sort of classify myself that way, but in a literal sense, yes, I use a whole bunch of different things. It's only when I have an opportunity to make an exhibition that I do any of these installation things. They're all improvised on the spot. So like before I got into this room, I literally had no idea what I was going to do as far as arranging any of these things. It was all just like the paintings and the drawings, based on instinct. What I did bring was I brought a bunch of materials, right? Ben, what I was asking when I asked you about whether you had formed a connection with those stones that you were looking at and collecting, it's because I have a connection with these materials. They're not just random. So somebody recently asked me if they might give me some sticks or rocks, and while that is generous, and while I probably would say yes, it would be much, much more difficult for me to use those in an art project, because for me, this is not true for everybody, but it's true for me, and I can't explain this, but there's some kind of a connection that one can form with objects when they are things that you have personally noticed, at least for me, out there in the world, and thought, oh, that stick is one that I want to use. That other stick, I don't need that one. So I literally go around, there's a few places that I go that I have strong connections to just the place, and I will collect objects in those spots. And I'm also collecting places, because I'm always on the lookout for like, well, where's another place where I might be able to get some interesting things? But in order for that to work, I need to spend some time in a place and really kind of walk around and just look. So a lot of these pieces of wood came from Montauk, the very end of Long Island. That's where I collected a bunch of this stuff. In fact, we were talking about the weight of the rocks. A couple weeks ago, I was out there and I almost couldn't make the trip. You have to hike down and then back up some cliffs in the spot where I like to go. And it was like, I was at my limit. My backpack was full of rocks and a huge bag of sand.
Wow.
And so, yeah,
That
it
must
was
have
tough.
been fun.
I made a few trips, but the point is that having a connection to those objects, I think, is important for me. So that's why I asked you if you had developed a connection.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Anna?
Going back to like our previous conversations about Maine, are any of these pieces inspired from Maine, or
From
are
Maine?
these, particularly?
Well, definitely. The paintings, probably not specifically to Maine in terms of the paintings at this point, but all of what I said before in terms of my background rests on outdoor, plein air landscape painting in Maine. That's what I really feel. My parents are they live in Maine, my mother's family is from Maine. I've spent a lot of time up there painting, and Savannah's from Maine as well. That's how we got on that topic. I basically kind of credit walking around in South Bristol and finding places to paint landscape paintings for sort of teaching me, and this is not to say that I'm great at it, but that's for what I know about painting, I learned most of it by painting landscapes in Maine. And those are straightforward landscapes, like where you will recognize things like trees and grass and rocks. But none of those are here. It's just that all of these paintings kind of have grown from that at some point or other. So no, none of these paintings are like directly related to Maine, but a lot of the objects are. Like there's certainly some pieces of wood and some stones that came from Maine within the last year or so, yeah. And Montauk is new. I've developed a connection to Montauk over the last couple of years, but it still feels rather new, but that makes it kind of exciting to find some things out there, because the rocks and the sticks from Montauk are different from the rocks and the sticks from Maine, so you get different character for these things, depending on where you are and where they have kind of landed.
Hi, my name is Adeline. I don't know how I can word this, but basically, I'm trying to transition to more abstract work within my own work. And it's really difficult as a portrait painter and someone who is very observational and just kind of replicates what I see, to kind of break out of that and just kind of freely develop from experiences or from nothing or from everything.
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest things I get stuck in, which I'm curious about your process in this, is what I get stuck in, what am I trying to communicate, or what am I trying, what do I want my audience to grab, what do I want my audience to feel, what are they supposed to, why am I doing this? So I don't know if I'm wording this right or if I'm getting to the right question here, but what do you decide in your work? What is the goal for you in these works? Because they are your experiences, but like you've mentioned, they may not be recognizable to many people who look at it. So what do you what makes you feel this is it for you? Or when you say, I like how this is making me feel, kind of what's driving you to creating this and the finished result?
That's a great question, and I don't have answers to all. There's a lot of parts to your question. I don't have answers to all of them. What drives me? So I've already sort of touched on the idea that there's a lot of similarity among the images. There's a lot of triangles right now. There's a lot of straight lines. There's a lot of bright color. But at least in my mind, there are no two paintings in here that are really alike. Really alike. And one of the reasons for that is that I sort of think of them, while I'm working on them, I don't know who they are yet at first. Through the process of adding marks, taking marks away, painting for me is a physical process, right? I'm doing physical things to this material, whether I'm spreading it around a surface, whether I'm dabbing it on a surface, whether I'm scraping it away or sanding it, or I do things like I spray alcohol. These are mostly acrylic paintings. If you spray alcohol on acrylic, even after it's dry, you can still dissolve it and begin to scrape it away. And these are little technical tricks, but I enjoy just the physicality of that. And while that is happening and an image begins to develop, I begin to recognize kind of a personality for the picture. So it's not a person, obviously, but it has a feeling. And if you, although they are similar to one another, they're not all the same. If you took two of them, and if I took two of these paintings and I asked you, okay, so think about food. This painting, or one of these paintings is more like Skittles, and another one of these paintings is more like a brownie. Which is which? You'd have an answer, right? Skittles and brownies are different. We couldn't tell you, I don't know exactly what the personality of a Skittle is, or what a brownie is about to tell me. But I can recognize that they're different and they're distinct from one another. And that's how I know that there's a particular kind of a personality that exists in an image. And that's kind of what I'm after. That's the goal, is to make something that has what feels to me like a very specific personality to it. As far as going from portrait painting and branching out into abstraction, again, there's no formula for like how to do that. But next time you have a brush in your hand and you're painting a portrait, maybe ask yourself like, well, I'm gonna make this mark for this plane of the nose, but instead of just leaving it at that, maybe I'm just gonna drag my brush down a little bit and see what happens. That'll be a mark that won't fit with the face, but it might have an interaction with some of the other marks that are already there that could lead you to another idea. Oh, I like the way that line has extended out past the place where I would normally think it should go. And maybe it links up with another line that's coming straight down from the ear, and so now you have these two marks that are doing something weird that have a relationship to one another and to the rest of the painting that maybe surprises you. And continue with that sort of way of thinking. And another way to think about it is that, like when I'm painting, I like to think about these paintings as little, as I said before, little visual adventures. On an adventure, like, you don't know what's around the next corner, right? So you have to have faith to step around that next corner, and maybe you'll find something interesting, and maybe you won't. And if you don't, you gotta step around the next corner. And that to me is kind of what mark making is like. Well, what is that next mark gonna be? And is it gonna be something that's gonna be interesting enough for me to kind of like pause at that spot, take a look at the view? Or is it gonna be something where I'm like, oh, yeah, this is not so great. I'm gonna go around over the next hill or something. So yeah, it's the faith to continue to take steps and make decisions about whether those steps are enough or not enough yet.
I'd like to add something to that, because I think your question, I think, is coming from a place where, I don't know, I was coming from when I asked something earlier. When I made that transition from being a still life painter to an abstract painter in graduate school, and I didn't know how to do that. I think one of the things I was thinking about when I was listening to you talk about your background in science is that I don't know if you knew it when you made the transition into art, but that it seems to me like you had this kind of ready-made content, like you already knew that you loved nature and you loved the landscape, and you know, had these adventures outdoors, and that ended up informing your work. Whereas I didn't know what I didn't know what I wanted to paint about. I'm still not exactly sure. I have some ideas, but I'm not really sure. And so I had to just, like what Nick's saying about, you know, that portrait painting and just dragging the line down, you know, just put stuff down on canvas. And then it was months that I was doing this for, and I was making those Willem de Koonings, and then I started making this painter Al Held. I started making these Al Held paintings, and there was one day, it was shortly after my grandfather passed away, and it was very difficult for me, and I was sitting in my studio, and I sat back from this painting that I was working on, and I was like, I know what my work's about. And it had to do with my grandfather's passing, but it was also really heavily informed by the paintings that I was doing, just in terms of trying to make these paintings look a particular way, working with the paint, working with the marks, and it was like, it's about death. And I think if you just keep going, because Adlin's an amazing painter, and if you just keep going, you just keep making marks, and you just keep putting stuff on paper and canvas, at some point, something will click. And then, like how Nick's saying, at some point he recognizes something in the painting that reminds him of a place he's been or a experience that he's had. It'll be like, okay, now I can use that thing that I've identified to now kind of direct the work, even if it's, you know, kind of from a distance, like you're not planning it all out and saying, I'm gonna illustrate this. That becomes more conscious intention that you can bring to the work.
Truth.
George, sorry.
I just want to comment that I really liked what you said about intentionality. I think there's a fine line there with how much intention we can assume that the observer would even know about the artist, right? Not knowing you, not hearing you, we're just going to experience the work ourselves, right? So, experimentation too, it sounds like. The way you described how you produce and seeing a relationship and then either continuing with that and taking it somewhere else or just, you know, moving away from it.
Yeah.
I was thinking about the analogies with education and the learning process and how often, too often still, traditional educator, just to brand them that, will assume that the student ought to be able to take their idea, ready packaged, into their own mind and unpack it just the way that the teacher intended it to be. And I think that that's ultimately impossible. What you also described is that interaction, right? So that allowing the observer to have that interaction and do some of the work. I think there's a wonderful analogy there to be had with the learning process. I mean, it sounds very much like Dewey in Artist Experience, what you were describing. I think he would thought that that was a wonderful, succinct account of his very large work. But yes, yeah, something to I think to be learned, I think, from artists in terms of how we approach education itself. This idea of we don't allow students to do the work themselves because we, you know, maybe pontificate an idea and assert it as this is what you need to know, as opposed to allowing that kind of exploration. And I see that in art courses, in our classes. I'm just always moved by the fact that we have that as part of education, always that there's some place where students can go and they can actually experience what I think the ideal process of learning actually happens. So I just wanted to share that based on how I heard you describe your process. I thought that was wonderful.
Oh, thank you very much. Pontificate is my middle name.
And I think that's sometimes why art can be difficult for students, because they're so used to learning in a particular way, and then you tell them, no, there is no one answer, there is no way to do it, and it's like, what? No, there's got to be something that you're not telling me. What do you want? What do you as the teacher want me to do? It's like, I want you to do what you want to do. To a certain extent, I'm going to grade you, but now there's a little contradiction there.
I guess I did have one question. That would be, did you draw outside the lines when you were a kid?
Literally or metaphorically? I
Really,
tried not to at first, you know, I tried
Good.
not to.
Good.
What I loved doing in coloring books was making one dark outline around every shape and then filling in the middle with just a little bit lighter. I don't know why I like that, but there was linear and then filling in, which is often what I'm doing now. Just to back up for a second, to build off something you said, Suzanne, you mentioned sort of feeling like you didn't know what you were doing at first, and then you felt like you didn't know what you were painting about. I don't know really, I mean, I've tried to explain it tonight, but I don't really know what I'm painting about now even. But I can say that as far as sort of like having something to paint about, for me, this is not true for everybody, but it's definitely true for me, the years that I spent between my undergraduate degree and getting to go to graduate school, there were several years in there where I basically just was collecting life experience. And I wasn't doing that with any kind of like, you know, long-term goal. I was just doing stuff and having fun. But that gave me something to think about, at least, while I'm working. So for me, really the value cannot be overstated of the time that I spent out of school. I don't think that all of this stuff, like, yes, I had a conversation with a student earlier today, and she was asking me about graduate school and like where she should try to go, and I don't have an answer for like where anyone should go to graduate school, and I actually kind of maybe discouraged her from graduate school a little bit, not because I don't think she should go or that she could go, but because I felt like, I think it's important for people to go out and have some life first. And I also think that in my experience, this is definitely not true for everybody, but definitely true for me. One of the biggest benefits of, like I said, I didn't study art in undergraduate, so I can't speak to that, but in graduate school, one of the biggest benefits that I got out of going to graduate school was just that I had 2 years of time in a studio and really very few interruptions and very little responsibility other than just being there and doing it. So it was much more of a practical thing than it was like a school situation. The part about it that was, the part of it being a school situation that ended up being important was that there was a constant flow of other people who had more experience than I did, meaning visiting artists and visiting professors to have conversations with. It was the studio time and the conversations with other people from who had more experience. Those were the things that were valuable. It wasn't that I went to a particular school or took a particular class where somebody's told me how to make an abstract painting out of a concrete idea. Like, there wasn't any of that. It was just time in the studio. And my professor, same guy that I mentioned earlier, he would do things like visit our studios at 2 a.m. And like, if you were in the studio at 2 a.m., gold star. You know? And then he'd show up again at like 8 a.m. and if you weren't there, trouble. So, you know, he was pushing work ethic, and that really is, there's a work ethic, I think, that is involved in all of this. It may be a romantic pursuit in many people's minds where you kind of, maybe today you look at TikTok for 12 hours and then you have something to eat and then you sort of like casually go into the studio. Maybe that works for someone, but it certainly is not that way for me. It's much more of like it's like I, you know, put on my Carhartts and get into the studio, and like, if there's nothing that I can think of to do, you sweep the floor or like gesso a canvas or something like that. So there's a workman-like or work person-like sort of aspect to all of this, which I think is really important, because none of this, and it's not just visual arts, like any kind of creative pursuit requires effort, like real effort. It's hard work, and you can't get, I think very few people are able to get away with kind of being casual about their production. Yes.
Yes, I have one question. Is anybody else feeling hot in here? It's really stuffy.
Yeah, we can open a door, it's fine with me.
Alright, thank you.
We should probably wrap it up. Sonja, did you have a question, or?
I just wanted to like clarify with you, because you said that this is like not, it's intentional, but it's like improvising. So like these lines and these physical sculptures you made with the organic material, you never did it before? I mean, you've done it before, have you done it before, or like you just never did it this way before?
I've done things like this before. I've never done anything that's exactly like that before. They're all, like this one that's got a lot of sort of strict geometry to it that's on the floor. That's the first time I've ever done something like that. It's kind of an experiment. One of the wonderful things about a situation like this is that it gives me an opportunity to experiment. So the fact that I did that maybe will spark some other ideas for things that I hope I'll have a chance to do in the future. But yeah, they're not things that I have preconceived in any way. I literally showed up with boxes and boxes and bags full of sticks and rocks and colored blocks. There aren't very many colored blocks in any of these. Often, like when I first started doing these things, there were thousands of brightly colored blocks. So different, really pretty different from what you see here. But the point is, no, I improvise them, and I don't know what they're going to look like ahead of time. But you know, if you ever had fun with a kid playing with blocks or playing with Legos, or I made one time a sugar cube castle. That was, I don't know how many sugar cubes were in it, but I spent months working on it and gluing sugar cubes together as, you know, to stand in for little blocks of stone that you might make a castle with. And it was like, I don't know, the size of like half a ping pong table maybe. And I just love that kind of stuff. It's deep in me, I love it, and I'm still, those things are, in fact, while I was here, I had an amazing teacher in 6th grade. Her name was Alice Dater. she's dead now, she was old then, she was probably in her 70s even back then. And her husband was an Arctic explorer. And so she had stories for us about things that he had done and things that she had been able to do with him. And she was such a spirit. And the assignments that she gave us, the ones that I remember from that year, we spent the fall semester studying Africa, and we spent the spring semester studying South America and Latin America. And the way that she had us study those places was to imagine that we were on a trip, that we had left home and we were traveling around Latin America and South America, and we were writing letters home to our families, telling them about what we were doing in these places. So in order to write a letter like that, you have to do some research to figure out what you might be able to do in Peru, or when you're going up to see Machu Picchu, or what you might do in Tierra del Fuego. And in addition to the letters, she had us compile all those letters into what we called scrapbooks from our trips. And on the scrapbooks, for every country, you needed to make a title page. And the title page was generally made by taking a big piece of your scrapbook paper and making a collage there using construction paper and maybe objects if you could find them to, things that were appropriate to glue, like coffee beans were one that I remember gluing. And so we would make these title pages, and those were the most fun for me because I was able to make something that included objects and cutting out paper shapes and things. And literally a couple days ago, I was thinking to myself while I was in, I think I literally said out loud, "Thank you, Alice Dater, for making me make those title pages," because it really resulted in a lot of what I'm doing. I don't know why I started talking about that. Was that related to your question? Yes.
Just a comment. I was here Saturday.
Oh.
So I was here Saturday at an event on campus, and I passed.
You said, what is
And
that fool doing?
I must have stood there for about 15 minutes watching you, and you were so deeply immersed, and you were in this area, and you were moving, and you were back and forth,
Yeah.
taking them, moving them, shifting them. So for me, I got a chance to see part of your process. So I felt lucky me, but it was really very fascinating, and I was telling you about it,
Yeah.
right? So I was just saying how wonderful it was. And when I walked out, they were bringing a tour of alumni through. So I said to them, "Stop at the window."
Ah.
Caged animal.
Well, I hope you enjoyed it.
I did. I was fascinated.
Oh,
So,
thank you for sharing that.
yeah, it was
That's cool.
special. So
I
thank
get
you.
into a little zone sometimes. And
Yes, you were, because I was there for quite a while. You were digging deep.
It's the best place to be,
Yeah.
I think, for me.
And you had all these things all around you, and I'm thinking, what?
Yeah, it gets chaotic.
Yeah.
I only used a small portion of the things that I brought, but that, one of the things that has been happening is that I have found that the paintings have become quieter over time. I mentioned earlier there are ones that are like full of things or swirling and crazy, but they have begun to kind of empty out. And I used this quote a couple weeks ago from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who most people know from The Little Prince, but he also wrote many other things. One of which is called, I think it's called Wind, Sand, and Stars. It's an autobiographical account of his time flying airplanes, and he talks about in there simplicity at one point, and he's referring to things like airplane wings and industrial design, but I won't get the quote exactly right, but it's along the lines of, perfection is not when there's nothing left to add, it's when there is nothing left to be removed from something. And so I'm thinking about that seems appropriate to me, and the painting's getting quieter, and the installation parts, the arrangements of objects are also getting, I think, for me, they're more pleasing now when they're more Spartan. So although I brought a ton of stuff, I ended up not really using most of it, but I like that. I like that they're quieting down, and I hope that for me, they are kind of like these little concentrated little worlds, and as opposed to these sprawling things that are complicated and difficult to look at. Along those lines, I will say that one of my critiques of what is in this room at the moment is that there's actually too much. And the reason I think that is because this arrangement here is the first thing that I did, and it has a very different feeling now that it is next to all this stuff. And that might not be easy to pick up on or even easy to imagine, but for me, it's like, it's too loud over on this side now. And like, this thing is kind of getting in the way of the experience of that and vice versa. And maybe that's too nitpicky of me, but I wish there were like 30 more feet in between these things so you could really kind of like experience them individually as opposed to kind of clashing with one another. That's the way it goes. We've got the 30 feet that we've got.
Yeah. So for the objects that you get when you go out, like in nature and stuff, do you kind of see that distinction of like when you're out, like you see something so different, you just kind of get that mindset when you create these abstract paintings? Because the more I look at them, I see such a similarity in shape, and I see that there is a connection, but also a distinction in that way. And I can see that your perspective is like certain materials in nature that can be different, and it kind of screams more than anything else. And I feel like you mentioning that all these materials that you had and them streaming together, I just really thought about that too, because there can be something so different, but when you put everything, a bunch of different things all together, it can be too different, and it's like too loud for you to actually understand or really get the whole scenario of what it is. So do you have this kind of connection when it comes to like seeing like the object and also like doing your abstract art and like the paintings and stuff? Do you have like a connection for that? Is there like something similar, or is it just more that the object itself is more?
I'm not totally sure if I'm following you, but let's see. Are you asking me if I'm seeing connections between the objects and the paintings?
I think it's more or less like the way that you do your abstract paintings. Do you have that mindset similar to how you see these objects in nature? Do they kind of give you that same kind of vibe?
Yeah, so like the thing that's so hard for me to describe, I think you're asking me now, like, is whatever that thing is something that I feel can be in common between the paintings and the objects? And the answer is yes. Whatever that thing is, it's one of those. It's one of those things where the answer is like, well, I don't know what it is, but I know it when I feel it, right? That's not a very helpful answer, but it is an honest answer. And so that is true about both the paintings and the objects. I don't know what the objects, like how they're going to end up being arranged when I find them, but for example, with these ones, I walked on the beach and I chose not to take many things, but there were certain things that when I saw them, I thought, that one I want. To try to quantify that in some way or give you sort of an answer about how I make that decision, that is something that is not easy. So I don't know exactly what it is that happens when I see something either in the character of an object or in something that I have put onto a canvas that makes me think I want to leave that alone now, or I want to pick that up and take it with me. But I do recognize the feeling when I have it, when I feel it. So in that way, they're connected. There's also literal connections. So if you stand at certain places in the room and you look and you see the objects and you see the paintings that are near them, you'll find that I hope, the intention is that they will visually connect in a way that, like, from this angle, I don't see it. But if I move over here, oh, it kind of locks into place and we see things, we recognize a specific connection that's there. And I hope that happens between the arrangements as well. So one of the things I'm thinking about a lot is relationships. You know, like if these two marks are parallel here on the canvas, can I make something else that's parallel in another location that will link up to them visually? One of the things our brains do is they look for patterns. So this is getting to sort of like the students a little bit, but like if you want to try to generate interest from a viewer, one of the things, there are many things you can do, but one of the things you can do is you can create subtle patterns, or what we might call repetition of form. So you might have a person sitting in you're painting of somebody who's like a model is sitting in a certain position, and the overall shape of their body maybe mimics some piece of furniture that just happens to be in the background, and you didn't notice it at first, but eventually you see, oh, wait a minute, that chair that's back there has a very similar kind of shape to the way that the person's body is sitting in this other part of the image. Well, that's a perfect opportunity to create repetition of form. So it doesn't need to be literal repetition of like 2 models or 2 chairs. It can be things that are really unrelated, except that visually they have this kinship. And Diebenkorn was like a master of that stuff. So if you're observant, you can find things that are out there in the world that will spark some recognition that they could be used together. It could be the foundation for some kind of relationship that will be intriguing to people on a subconscious level.
Okay, thank you so much, Nick, and thank you everybody for coming. Feel free to stick around and you can speak to Nick one-on-one and have a glass of wine